all. It's 6 o'clock. I'm going to call the meeting to order and ask you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next thing we have to talk about is approval of the agenda. It's been circulated. We need to add to the agenda election of officers, and I'm going to suggest that that should tuck in after approval of minutes. Does anybody have any objection to that?
No objection.
Okay, hearing no objection, then the agenda will be deemed approved as amended. And that moves us to approval of minutes. Does anybody have any suggested changes to the minutes of the September 7th meeting?
You know, I did not see anything, but my record lately has been pretty embarrassing. As the person that would usually catch the commas and the minuscule little issues, I have been outshone, maybe would be the word, by others recently. So I'm doubting my own ability to catch that stuff.
So you're turning this all over to Beth?
Yeah, it's all on her. I think the substantive stuff is all correct.
Okay.
I agree with that.
Okay. Then I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
Support?
All in favor?
Aye.
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 They are approved. That brings us to the election of officers. We have three positions to fill: chair, vice chair, and secretary. Is there a motion for that?
I move that I'm nominating Brooke Smith as chair, Beth Phillip as vice chair, and unless the chair rules it out of order, I would also nominate Peter Mayer as secretary, even though he's not here to defend himself, so I don't want to put him in a jam unless somebody has had some previous conversation. We could just hold that one.
I don't think we should worry. I mean, he didn't come, so he gets to be
He always has the chance to
Yeah.
resign the honor at the next meeting, I guess. So in that case, I would nominate Brooke Smith as chair, Beth Phillip as vice chair, and Peter Mayer as secretary.
So I'd like to second the nomination.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Well, look at that, a sweep. Now we're on to public comment on non-agenda items. Is there anybody here who showed up after our 8-month sabbatical to talk to us about things that aren't on our agenda tonight? Hearing none, we're ready to move on to action items. Action item number 1 is 22 ZBA 897. The applicant is Terry Kleinschmidt for the property at 9367 Ann Street. First inquiry is, does anybody have a conflict of interest or ex parte contact to reveal?
I have none.
Not of which I'm aware, no.
Okay, and I have none either. So, David, tell us about this matter.
Welcome back, everybody. As Brooke mentioned, this is 22 ZBA 897 to the College Street, and the address is 9367 Ann Street, section 2 parcels, 040320702 and 001 off Ann Street. So the applicant has an existing home on the property and a couple of small existing sheds. He's attempting to rebuild the existing cabin, 2-story, 2,200 plus
questions of David?
I
Yes,
just
ma'am.
have a brief one. So this does not change the minimum, the nonconformity of the minimum lot area? Like, this won't expand the amount of area
You're
that?
talking about lot coverage?
Yeah.
No, because this coupled with this, with the structure across the street, they allow them to 3% required.
Okay, okay, thank you. Yes, and thank you for correcting me on that.
Any other questions for the Director of Planning and Zoning? Hearing none, I think we're ready for the petitioner presentation. Tell us what you want to do.
I'm Terry Kleinschmidt, the owner of the property. You need to turn the microphone on. Okay. Can you hear me?
Good before.
I'd just like to give you a brief history on the property. My mother-in-law purchased our property on Silver Lake in 1933, before she was married. In 1934, she hired a man to build a small cottage on her property. It was the Depression. So the foundation of the cottage was a dish pan filled with cement, turned upside down, and one was put under each of the four corners. The cottage had no heat or water, but it did have electricity. The 2x4 walls were eventually covered in pine paneling, but it was never insulated. Plumbing was installed in the mid-1950s. At the time the cottage was built, only 3 other cottages existed on the lake. Ann Street only extended to the top of the hill. In other words, there was no road to our property. Over the years, additional property was purchased, some on the other side of Ann, and eventually the cottage next door. My husband was responsible for the upkeep and improvements on the cottage for the last 50 years. He found ways to make sure everything was safe and secure. Unfortunately, he has passed, and several of the issues with the cottage have quickly become insurmountable. With the serious structural issues that currently exist, it is my hope and my family's hope to construct a new cottage that will last another 88 years. And yes, we hope it will have plumbing and heating too. Do you have any questions for me?
Questions for the applicant? No, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that was pretty quick in terms of questions for the applicant. That means we're on to the public hearing, which starts with reading of letters into the record. We have several different letters. They're all positive. Oh, did you want to say something, sir?
Yeah, I'm Scott McElrath.
Yes.
Terry's architect, and I was just gonna augment her.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, so just a couple things. Terry and I are two people that are getting older. I don't know if any other people are, but the existing cottages were joined together, but there's steps, there's interior steps. We're trying to make the new cottage all the same level. You know, the garage is gonna be lower, obviously, but it's also the 2 cottages were unfortunately kind of built right into the earth, so they are rotting out. It sounds like the original foundations were kind of suspect to begin with, but the bottom are rotting out because it's wood against dirt. So we're trying to rectify a couple of those things, as well as the insulated quality of the new house, while working with this strange site that's very long, but it's very narrow. So that's why the house is a little bit longer. It's trying to sort of mimic the existing footprint of the 2 cottages that have been joined together, but making it slightly more user-friendly for Terry's family.
Okay. Any questions of the architect? No? All right, that means that we're on to public hearing, and I had started to say that we have, I think, at least 3 letters in the file that are all positive. I'm not gonna bother to read them now, but they are available, if anyone needs to check, to see what they say. So now we're ready for comments from the public. Is there anyone here tonight that would like to speak to this request? Yes, ma'am, come on up. Tell us who you are, where you live, and what you think about it.
Hi, I'm Cindy Mott Berlecki. I live at 9541 Ann Street, and I'm feeling very old. Oh my goodness. I had the privilege to grow up with Terry's husband on Silver Lake, and it was so many years ago that we used outhouses. Our water supply was a pump in the house, and the pipe went out to the lake. So I guess I'm proof that all these years later, I'm still here, so our water quality is very good there. Silver Lake is a gem, and we love it. We have a true love of the lake, and the Kleinschmidt family has always been stellar neighbors, people with their property, helping with the lake. I know that they want to continue their memories at the lake, and I hope that his son and his brother will make the memories and the love that I have, and I know the Kleinschmidt family has. They honor and respect the lake, and I encourage you to let them have a new home to make new memories. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to speak?
My name is Linda Singer, 9260 Ann Street, and it's Silver Lake. And I got to know Terry and Don when I was the Silver Lake Association president. And we were having some issues about what time you could go out on the lake without boats speeding by, and what time the boats had to stop speeding by at night. And Don researched it all, and we ended up bringing it to you, and we made a proposal, and we now have certain times, and it's based on daylight saving, and that was all Don's efforts, or a lot of it. And so we call it Don's proposal, or I don't know what you guys call it when you do it, but anyway. But I also want to let you know that this family worked so hard to make Silver Lake their home, and they are great people. Unfortunately, some people above them have created a nightmare with all the way to the road. And Terry had to spend lots of money to have stone and dirt brought in so that we can go closer to her house. She's tried lots of things to improve the area, and I support her 100%.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to address the ZBA on this variance request? Okay, that means that we're ready to close the public comment section, and we can move on to ZBA deliberations and standards of review. I don't know if we have to talk a lot about this, but I want to raise an issue that I just figured out this afternoon, which is that when our new ordinance was, I think there's essentially a drafting error in the ordinance, because on the page that talks about the decision criteria, we have in the past always said that the decision criteria is that the variance be the reasonable amount necessary to mitigate the practical difficulty. And the section now reads in large bold face, red, reasonable amount, the variance is the minimum amount necessary to mitigate the practical difficulty, which is not the standard that has been applied in this township during the last version of the ordinance, and is a much stricter standard than I think we ought to apply, especially given the fact that in boldface and red, it says reasonable amount, even though the text says minimum amount. And I spoke with David about this afternoon. I think that the solution for us is to have David use his superpowers as the Director of Planning and Zoning to make an interpretation that says that for our purposes this evening, the variance requirement is the reasonable amount necessary, not the minimum amount, and that then this issue be taken to the Board of Trustees as soon as possible to fix this language problem.
Yeah.
So with that said, then our decision criteria, which were distributed and which say reasonable amount necessary, actually then comply with what the ordinance says.
Can I ask David a question?
You certainly may.
David, are you aware of any alterations are aware of any case law that maybe created this alteration?
I'm not aware of any case law. I think the minimum standard would be the impossible standard to meet. I agree with both that. I think in drafting this ordinance over the 7 years that it took, that this was simply a typo. The standard has always been reasonable since 2003. We will apply the same standard in post this new ordinance. So, yeah, I think reasonable standard is the standard we should use.
Were either of you able to find state law that would have supported either interpretation?
In the hour and 15 minutes that existed between the time that I figured out this problem and the start of the meeting this evening, no. But it again, to me, it's so clear to me that there was a mistake made in the preparation of the documents that apparently nobody caught as it was working through the system. The fact that David is prepared to interpret it for us to understand, at least for the moment, that reasonable amount is what is intended, since it's in big bold letters. My suggestion is that that's how we ought to proceed with a request, and I think Dave's already going to act on this, to go through the appropriate process to get the language fixed. But I don't think we ought to make the applicant wait for a revision to the ordinance to allow us to consider using the reasonableness standard. Yeah.
Yeah, not only does that make sense to me, but, you know, we, or if there were all 5 of us, we could collectively determine what's reasonable. Trying to determine what's minimum, I think we start getting out calculators, and that leads to stupid stuff.
Well,
Oh, you don't need 7.5 feet. You could have done that, you know, back at 25 feet or whatever, and then we're designing something. So reasonable, I get. The concept of minimum doesn't even seem to make sense to me. So yeah, I certainly support everything you said. I know that, well, like David said, the new zoning ordinance was in the works for 7 or so years. And there were some things right to the end that after everybody, all those years had looked at it, still didn't see. So this could very well be one of those.
But the
It's a
old
cumbersome process to correct it.
In fairness,
But we should start.
the old ordinance specifically said the reasonable amount necessary. So this language is a change from the old ordinance.
That makes sense.
But I think an unintended change. So that's my view, is that we ought to use the decision criteria as circulated for us that says the variance is the reasonable amount necessary. All right, does anybody else on the board want to discuss this further, or do you have any other questions for David about how we're gonna proceed?
I don't have questions. I do have a question though. Further.
Yes,
So given that there's no foundation for this house, so are you okay with the house remaining basically substantially where it is now? Is that okay with everybody? I mean, given that there's a garage, there'll be off-street parking, but I just wanna make sure that we're okay with that and something is said about that.
well, I think that the important thing to think about is, given the slope of the ground behind the home, I'm not clear on how they could move it back from the street. And maybe, I mean, I just looked at it and thought, yeah, this can't go back toward the lake unless we say, well, you know, the reasonable size of this house should be 1,300 square feet rather than 2,400 square feet, or make that kind of a calculation. And my view is that the 2,400 is the reasonable amount necessary, and that since they're fitting it inside the existing footprint, I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure, and I guess this is a question for David. Is everything within the existing footprint, or I thought that down at this end, it's 7.5 feet from the right-of-way. At the other end, it may be back a little farther, but by allowing it to all be no closer than 7.5 feet, I don't think we've changed. It does not require an additional variance. The footprint may be slightly different. It's essentially the same size place, but once we grant 7.5 feet, they can do 7.5 feet everywhere along from right-of-way to the structure, correct?
Well, 7.5 feet is the closest that the structure would be to the edge of the road. So,
Yes.
So whatever is approved here would be permitted and built in substantial compliance with what's approved here. So
Okay.
if any of the footprint of the nature of the structure should change and encroach upon or any setbacks, then they would need to come back to you.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
All right. So does this mean that the ZBA is ready to move through the criteria? All right, we've got water body setback first and front setback second. I need two answers as we go through these. The first criteria is 1, practical difficulty, 2906C1. The strict application of the terms of this ordinance would constitute a practical difficulty. Marty?
Yes and yes.
Beth?
Yes and yes.
And the chair votes yes and yes as well. The size of the house they're looking for is reasonable. The shape and size of the lot essentially require a variance be granted in order to allow them to continue to build what is a reasonable structure on the property. 2, physical conditions, 29.06C2. The practical difficulty is due to some physical condition peculiar to the property involved. Marty?
Yes and yes.
Beth?
Yes and yes, and I would just raise the discussion that we had with regard to the offset from the front. And that, you know, it would be very difficult, given the sloping of the property, to adjust the location of the house on the property.
Okay, and the chair votes yes and yes for the same reason. 3, self-created, 29.06C3. The practical difficulty is not self-created. Marty?
Yes and yes, and I'd like to just note that the original structure and most of the evolution between what it started out as and what it is today predated any Dexter Township zoning ordinances.
Beth?
Yes and yes.
And the chair votes yes and yes as well. 4, reasonable amount necessary, 2906C4. the variance is a reasonable amount necessary to mitigate the practical difficulties. Marty?
Yes and yes.
Beth?
Yes and yes.
And again, as we have already discussed, we're going with reasonable amount rather than minimum amount because we think there was a failure to catch a mistyped word, and we've got the Director of Planning and Zoning's interpretation that says by going reasonable, we're doing the right thing. So the chair votes yes and yes as well. 5, public health, safety, and welfare. Approval of the variance will not be injurious to the public health, safety, and welfare. Marty?
Yes and yes, and I would expect that with the new architect design structure that some of the existing issues will be resolved with the new structure.
Beth?
Yes and yes for the reasons Marty just stated.
And the chair votes yes and yes as well. 6, adjacent properties, 2906C6. Approval of the variance will not affect the use of adjacent properties or the area in a substantially adverse manner. Marty?
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
And the chair votes yes and yes as well. I think the letters in the file and just looking at the situation indicates that this will be a plus for the neighborhood. 7, intent of the ordinance, 2906C7. Approval of the variance is consistent with the intent and purpose of this ordinance. Marty?
Yes and yes.
Beth?
Yes and yes. I think it's going to be a significant improvement, and given that they've taken such care to place the structure in a similar manner to what the other structures had already been placed, I think that they've done a good job of that.
And the chair votes yes and yes as well. And that puts us in a position where the chair would entertain a motion.
I can do a motion.
Love
Unless
it when
Marty,
you
you
do it.
really want to do one.
No, you are so good at it, I would not
You are
even
the
pretend.
mover.
Okay. I'd like to make a motion to approve the variance for petition 22 ZBA 897 for the property located at 9367 Ann Street, tax ID number D0403207012 and D0403206001 by the applicant Terry Kleinschmidt for a reduced water body setback of 31.7 feet rather than the 50 feet required, and a reduced front setback from Ann Street of 7.2 feet rather than the 25 feet required, recognizing the nonconformities that are listed on page of the staff report.
Support.
And then with that motion, we'll include the concept that the structure will be built substantially in compliance with the plans that we have reviewed.
And so I'll amend the motion in that the structure will be built in substantial compliance with the plans that have now been reviewed.
Support.
Okay. All those, well, no, let's do this by voice. Marty?
Yes.
Beth?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes as well. Congratulations, you have your variance. It's only good for a year. Get going.
Thank you.
You bet. And that moves us along to public comment on non-agenda items. For those of you that were here listening to us handle this, what other things would you like to talk to us about that were not on the agenda? Okay, now, oh, you do?
I always say something.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us.
I want to know if you have property and your house sets back maybe 20 feet from the road, are you allowed to cement in your house to the road, especially if you're on a hill?
ZBA can't answer those kind of questions for you. Sorry.
Why?
Because our job is to decide variances, and if you,
It's only variances that
Well, that's, we do that. I'm sure that the Director of Planning and Zoning can provide you.
This is something that we've discussed before.
So answer your question in May.
There you go,
There you
see?
go.
So it really, if you create a situation where your stormwater management coverage, your lot coverage, for your purchase surface coverage is over a certain amount, you need to follow the stormwater management policy. So that's meant to officially and technically all rain, all water on the property should stay on that property. If they run off from other properties, no, that
Terry had to deal with that, so.
yeah, and that's in the township, oftentimes that has to get involved because there's potentially, there can also be the road commission that's involved too, because sometimes they need to actually create drainage or something specialized on this, so much slow.
It's terrible. It's ridiculous. Plus, there's too many people that are going to add cement to the buckets on the water side.
Well, if they do, let us know, because technically in order to add it, you know, we need to come to the permit.
And they will. And I think they are finding it shortly. Thank you.
You bet.
I have one more comment and then you can go home.
Okay.
Just because there aren't any crazies here.
We are on live stream, however. People,
Yeah, don't-
people,
yeah,
people can
be
pull this
careful.
up
You-
after.
you-
Yeah.
Maybe I better not. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll ask you later. Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, happy to give you the warning.
Yep.
All right.
And you are doing such a good job with all the permits and everything. I know it's hard and it's very bittersweet for those of us who are, my family's been there 100 years, to take down old structures, you know, but it is needed and we appreciate all of your help and really so much hard work for you. But we appreciate it.
Well, thanks for those kind words.
Where's the rest of the committee?
They were, they realize how much fun it is, but they couldn't make it tonight.
But didn't you used to have like 6 or 8?
We're supposed to have 5. We have 2 MIAs this evening.
Well, there, we
Well,
have one vacancy.
Yeah, we have
and-
one vacancy if you're looking for a job.
I winter somewhere else.
So,
Very good.
Thank you.
thanks. We're on to 8 concerns of ZBA members, Director of Planning and Zoning, and the Recording Secretary. As I always like to start with Janice. Tell us your concerns.
The meeting's too short.
Yeah, it's.
We can fix
So, you don't get a, you're not paid by the, meeting, you're paid by the hour?
Yeah.
Oh, see, we get paid by the meeting, so we try to
There's
shorten it.
no incentive for us.
No incentive at all. Do you have any other concerns?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, good. David?
Great.
No specific concerns, I do appreciate the good catch, the wording, so I will start from the voice process, getting that adjusted. Also, I don't know how much I know Mark is obviously involved in the steering committee for the master plan review and rewrite, so, but I will, when we have a working draft of the copy, I will get a copy of it and ZBA as well to review, so that you feel like you're in the loop as well.
Thank you.
Start having a group of, or set up a public hearing, public engagement process starting this summer. The survey should be, so the postcard should be showing up in your mailbox here in the next month to 6 weeks, asking you to take on that survey, so please do that.
Okay,
We'll definitely keep the ZBA in the loop, so.
super.
Thank you.
Okay. Concerns from the board?
No.
Not a concern, just kind of a question for David, not asking you to prematurely divulge any details, but when do you anticipate we may have another ZBA meeting? Anything you see coming up for next month?
So that's a good question. So the deadline for next month was today.
Okay.
Not received anything. I will let you know about July. I know the July meeting is the day after the 4th of July, so I know that can be problematic for people if they're vacations and or, but I will have a better sense if we're gonna have something in July. Nothing in June. I'd like to say it's the new ordinance, but I think it's a combination of things. I think it's the pandemic. I do think the new ordinance is kind of affecting
we gonna get any money? I mean, so I have another thing that I'd like us to think about the next time we get together. We are supposed to have rules of procedure. Our last rules were adopted 9 years ago, and and they specifically mention the old ordinance. So my thought
Thank you.
is that, here's one for you, Marty, that
Thank
we
you.
all ought to just take a look at these and among ourselves or with David, ideally, David, it'd be great if you would look through them and make any suggestions that you would like to make, and then we could think about maybe being able to adopt new rules of procedure the next time we meet.
And something that has come to mind is particularly like the training, because I think some people are afraid to do this, thinking, I know nothing about that. And I will be honest, I went to the MSU, I forget what it was, but
Yeah,
yes, and that was an excellent class, and I'd like to, be able to encourage people to do this with the incentive of something like that.
Well, I have, talked to, I think, someone actively trying to recruit additional people to the ZBA too, so just in my dealings with people at different levels in the township, I have run into quite a few people that would be very quickly encourage them to apply, submit their resumes, see on the website, and just haven't had any takers so far.
Okay.
I'll keep at it, I'll keep encouraging people.
okay. Oh, and the other thing I also thought we ought to talk about that seems to have just sort of dried up and blown away is earlier this year, Michelle sent out a thing to
Oh, yeah.
all of the people on the ZBA saying, here, sign this, agree that you're an employee of the township and that you are governed by the township's conflict of interest rules. And I called her and said, wait, we're not supposed to be employees of the township. We shouldn't be signing this saying that. And please tell the other people who are ZBA members that they needn't sign it. And as far as I know, nothing happened about that. I don't know if it did.
So I signed the conflict of interest. I didn't have any issue with that. I specifically did not sign the other because there were all kinds of issues and conflicts. And I think I mentioned it to at least David when I submitted it. I haven't heard anything back. When I went over that, however, and yeah, it was mainly geared for you're an employee, which we're not. The other document, we're certainly not an at-will employee, so that would have been disingenuous or dishonest, immoral to even consider signing that. But one of the things I noted, and when the township board dealt with the latest development agreement, I realized that the township board operates under a much different conflict of interest policy than either the planning commission or ZBA. And I haven't gone through this word for word to see if it's exactly the same, but I think the ZBA is, if not identical, very, very close to the planning commission conflict of interest. And one of the items is, whether you're adjacent to whatever it is you're dealing with, and, a number of others, obviously dealing with, family, financial interest or whatever. I'm just kind of curious. I guess I'm not, even though I'm looking that direction, I'm not asking for an answer from staff, but I just found it curious that I could not find on the website, I haven't asked, but I could not find on the website what the township board considers to be conflict of interest.
I think it is I'd like to see us adopt new rules of procedure or upgraded rules of procedure, and then I think they ought to be published. I think people in the township ought to know this is how we conduct ourselves.
These are available on the website.
Are they? Where?
Now, the website is a little bit difficult for me to navigate yet.
It's on the ZBA page, there's
Oh, it is? Okay, well, that's good. Then particularly we ought to update it so it doesn't say 2013 and based on the old ordinance.
That 2013 kind of seems like yesterday to me, though.
Yeah, I
so
know. Yeah,
I wasn't around here for this, but
yeah,
that seems
yeah.
darn old.
Well, anyway, those are my concerns. Are there any other concerns or discussions or anything? Nothing else to talk about? Well, then we're at the end of our agenda and we're adjourned.
Very good.
Great, thank you. Chance, let us know when we're off, please.